Today's guest is a name that many of you will recognize, either from his work with Sports Illustrated, ABC and CBS, or for his outstanding books, which total 11 to date. Armen Keteyian, welcome to Next Steps Forward.
How are you, Chris?
I'm great, thanks. Armen, before we start, I think you and I would both be remiss if we didn't give a special thanks to the person who made today's show possible. The person I call the world's greatest neighbor, my dear friend Frank.
Frank Novello.
Yeah, Frank introduced us, believe it or not, over a decade ago. So I think you and I would take a lot of flack if we didn't mention him on air today. So just want to give him a little shout out.
Probably going to call me and just, wanted to know why his name wasn't mentioned 4 or 5 times during the podcast.
But put his name over yours, right?
Yeah.
So for those of you who don't watch television or may not read books about sports, Armen Keteyian grew up in Detroit and remains fiercely proud of his Midwest roots and work ethic. An 11-time Emmy Award-winning journalist and former chief investigative correspondent for CBS News, Armen Keteyian is one of the most widely recognized and finest journalists of our time. From his start as a sports writer at a suburban San Diego shopper in the late 1970s to his role as chief investigative correspondent for CBS News, Armen has always had a dogged determination to share compelling stories and the facts his audiences need to know. We'll delve into his fascinating career path, but in his role as a writer-reporter for Sports Illustrated, Keteyian reported on subjects ranging from corruption in college athletics to sports gambling in America. He was with ABC News for several years and spent over a decade in various roles with CBS News. He was a lead correspondent for 60 Minutes Sports on Showtime and the chief investigative correspondent for CBS News. Most recently, he served as anchor and executive producer for The Athletic, the digital sports media company. Armen Keteyian is the author of 11 books, including the #1 New York Times bestselling biography, Tiger Woods, which is set to be an HBO documentary in early 2021. Armen, before covering sports, you were a high school and college athlete. Tell us about your upbringing in the Midwest in general, and in particular, your days in college sports.
Well, I'm Detroit born and raised. In the 60s, I grew up with Motown and Bob Seger and, all the great music of Detroit in that period of time. I have that Midwestern work ethic. My dad was always working really hard, and he said to me, probably the best piece of advice he ever gave me was, if you work hard, people will notice, and they have noticed over the years. I was an athlete growing up. I had a love of reading and a love of sports. Those were the yin and yang of my early life. Played 3 sports in high school at Lasser High School in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. Was actually the most valuable player of my baseball conference in my senior year on a team that was very, very good, that went 30 games as a high school seniors at Lasser High. And I went to Central Michigan to play baseball. When I got out there, the first time I ever went out, and I was recruited to go there, and I was on a partial scholarship, and I went out to shortstop, and they were like, I don't know, 12 other guys out there at shortstop. And I'm looking around going, well, what are you guys all doing out here? They're like, oh, I was all state in Ohio. And then I looked around at another guy who was all regional, Rick Tuma. I'm like, Rick, what are you doing here? He goes, oh, I got recruited. So I'm looking around going, oh man, it's a little different than high school. And, I learned a lot there. I ended up starting as a sophomore at shortstop, and it was a big deal at the time. And, I was you're just under tremendous pressure. I learned a lot about what it's like to play, kind of big time college sports. Central had gone to at the time, the NAIA finals the year before I was recruited. They were probably the best baseball team in the state of Michigan at the time, better than Michigan and Michigan State. And so I played there, and, when you don't hit, you don't play. And I had a couple of periods of time where I wasn't hitting, and there was always somebody right behind me. I was pressing somebody was pressing me. And so, Mount Pleasant, Michigan, the weather, I had a girlfriend in California. So I went out there and I kind of fell in love with California. And I said, you know what, after my sophomore year, I transferred to San Diego State in the early 70s and sat out a year. And then I played at San Diego State. I started again at shortstop and at second and at third for the Aztecs, with a bunch of great guys that are still, many of them are still my friends today. And again, but if you don't hit, you don't play. And I had, I learned a lot about, I probably had more fun in the 70s at San Diego State with that team than I should have. And if I look back on it now, I would say, less would have been more at that period of time, more focused on baseball, less focused on girls and the sun in San Diego. But, Failure, Chris, has there's a lot of benefits to failure. And when you fail at something that you really love and that you think you think you're really good at it, and then you run into people that are also really good at it at the elite collegiate level, that failure to me has really spurned me in a lot of ways for the further successes that I've had, in my life. It's so, it's a hard lesson to learn sometimes, but it's a lesson that stayed with me for a long time.
Well, I'm sure the weather's a little different in Michigan versus San Diego this time of year. So
Oh, yeah.
another good choice. So your college sports days took you from Michigan to San Diego, and there you landed your first journalism job at the Suburban Shopper.
Yeah.
How'd that come about?
Well, I graduated from state, actually worked for a senator by the name of Frank Church, who ran for president in 1976 against Jimmy Carter and Mo Udall and Jerry Brown. And I ended up doing advance work for Senator Church. I was 23 years old, and I was traveling around the country. And he won a couple of primaries, and I kind of became a big shot on the campaign for a while. We thought for a while he was going to get a vice presidential nod. He didn't. So I went back to San Diego, and, San Diego was a tough place to get a job in those days, and nobody left the Union or the Tribune. And even the suburban papers were stacked and stocked with really high quality talent. So I went to work. I got a job at the Life News, which was, as you said, a suburban shopper that they threw on people's doorsteps at Wednesday afternoon. And I was the sports editor, only because I was the only person in the sports department, so I could call myself the sports editor. And but it was great, a first job. I was writing a column. I was covering high school sports. I learned a lot about the responsibilities of being a weekly journalist. And fortunately, I was only there for 4 months when a really big coveted job opened up in Escondido, California, at the Times Advocate, which was at the time a Chicago Tribune afternoon daily. That was a very competitive job opening, and every young writer in San Diego wanted that job, and I was fortunate enough to get it. And that really kind of launched my journalism career, because I was working now on a daily newspaper, sometimes writing 2 stories a day. And you find out pretty quickly, honestly, whether you love the profession or not. You think about it in terms of the glamour of being a sports writer, but the day-to-day work, whether it was covering high school sports or San Diego State, or even sometimes the Chargers or the San Diego Sockers at the time, you find out pretty quickly whether you really you love what you're doing.
You mentioned earlier, failure at something that you love is something you've carried forward. Were there other lessons you learned in those first 2 jobs, or even your time as an athlete, as you mentioned, that have carried you through your career or carried you through your career to date?
Well, yeah, I think work ethic is one of them. How hard do you want to work? That's the first thing. And then, I've always had great passion for what I do. I'm very fortunate that I found my calling in life, I think, fairly early on, other than starting at shortstop for the Tigers or something like that. I always used to, as I said, I love to read. When I was in 8th grade, not to sound like too much of a geek, but I read the most books of any 8th grader at East Hills Junior High School for boys. They were all sports books, but I probably read, I don't know, 100 different books. And I was always reading, and the love of reading led to a love of writing. And so, that love of writing led me to writing for the high school newspaper, that led me to writing for the newspapers in college, that led me to my journalism career. And, I always was, I would set goals. I think that was one of the things that I learned early on from sports, discipline and setting a goal, whether it was a team goal or whether it was an individual goal. And I had always wanted to work for Sports Illustrated, like every other guy that was in the, sports writing business in those days. I grew up reading the magazine. It would come to the doorstep on Thursdays. I read it cover to cover. I was huge fans of the Frank DeFords of the world, the Dan Jenkins, William Oscar Johnson, all of the great Tex Mall, the great old writers at SI. And so my goal was to work for the magazine. So I was always sending my clips back to the magazine, trying to, generate their interest in hiring me as a reporter, which in those days was essentially a glorified, fact checker. And lo and behold, I left the Times Advocate after 2 years. And it was interesting because, as I said, you find out whether you really want to love to do something. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to be a sports writer. So I left the sports writing business after 2 years, and I went to work for a PR agency in San Diego, sports PR firm called the Phillips Organization. And my responsibilities were like Echelon, and which was the racquetball company at the time, and Speedo and things like that, the United States Triathlon Series. And I learned pretty early on that I didn't want to be in PR, but that was a good thing for me to learn because, a lot of people in the business go into PR, and being in PR for a year or so, I learned the other side of the fence, but I also learned that that's not what I wanted to do with my life. And so I was freelancing for the San Diego Union and for San Diego Magazine, and I was making kind of a reputation in town as being one of the better young writers. And I was sending those clips back to the magazine, and lo and behold, I got a call.
So in 1982, you make the move from San Diego to New York. Similar from going to Michigan to San Diego, very different environment. And obviously New York was very different back then.
Yeah.
How'd you make that adjustment?
Well, long story short, SI didn't offer those jobs very often. I mean, I used to read the masthead like it was the Rosetta Stone, and seeing if somebody was moving up the masthead or had left the magazine, and there was an opening, and I got a call, and there had to be hundreds of people that wanted that job, but I was fortunate enough. This was in February of 1982. I got a call and said, "We'd like to hire you as a reporter." And I was like, "Oh God, I want to take the job." And I told my wife, and Dee Dee, we've been married now 41 years. She was 8 months pregnant with our now oldest, Kristen. And I said to her, "I just got this job offer from Sports Illustrated. We got to go." And she says, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm 8 months pregnant. It's winter in New York City. It's David Dinkins, and it's the end of days kind of New York at that period of time. So I had to turn the job down. And I don't think anybody that I know in the history of the magazine has ever turned anything down as when they offered a job. And so they couldn't believe it. And they said, "Okay, we're not sure we're going to call you again." And I thought, okay, I'm going to live my life in San Diego. Well, sure enough, about 2 months later, they called back and they said, "We have another opening, and we're not going to ask a third time. And will you take the job?" I'm 29 years old. They offered $27,000 a year to move to New York City. Dee Dee had a job. We were making 60 grand a year between the two of us, living a very nice life with a house and 2 dogs and 2 cars and, blah, blah, blah. But you know what? Like you say, next steps forward, you have to decide what you want to do. I wanted to compete against the best. I wanted to see, I knew I could always come back to San Diego and work for the San Diego Union and have a career there. But I wanted to compete against the best. And so I said yes, and I went back. Dee Dee stayed behind. I lived with a friend in New York for a couple of months. I slept in my office at SI. Some nights when I really didn't want to bother Jay again, to bother him at his house. And Dee Dee came in August, and we lived in a 482 square foot apartment on 49th between 2nd and 3rd. And I just competed against, some of the very, very best young writers and reporters in the business to try to move up the masthead. So, as time went on, I used to think about it in terms of the treadmill, Chris. And I'd always just like, the harder I worked, the more hours I put in, I would just take that dial and I would just turn it up and see how many people I could knock off the treadmill by the amount of hours that I would put in. And I started to develop a reputation at the magazine of somebody that they could send out, and was pretty relentless when it came to the reporting side of things. And I would started to work with the senior writers on some big investigative pieces for the magazine. And after about 3 years, I became the magazine's top writer reporter in terms of investigations, and developed a reputation nationwide, I think, for my quote unquote special reporting qualities.
Well, I'm glad I was never on that treadmill in front of you. So that's a plus for me.
It was pretty rough. But and there were some great friends of mine. Ivan Maisel, who just he worked for ESPN for years and years. Joe Lieber, who became a senior writer. There were just some really talented people there, and it was just hyper competitive. But you're at Sports Illustrated. I mean, what do you expect? You're competing against the best of the best, and I wasn't afraid of it, and I kind of relished it. But I was not a I was rarely home, and that was the beginning of that kind of 30-year run of that.
Sure. So you go from writing about San Diego sports and culture to investigating and writing for Sports Illustrated about corruption in college sports, point shaving scandals, sports betting, which was not legal in most states until recently, and steroid use and abuse. I'm sure many people in our audience would like to know how you gain the trust of people that didn't really know you to get them to talk about such sensitive topics and reveal their secrets that nobody knows.
Well, there's no magic formula. It really is based on trust. When you're doing those kinds of big investigations, you're talking to a lot of different people. And I was very fortunate to have some great mentors there. One was Jack Tobin, who was our lead West Coast correspondent for the magazine. And Jack taught me the power of use of documents. So whether it was a divorce proceeding or a bankruptcy or a filing for a business or something. So when you would go into people, there was great preparation that was involved. And I think that gave people confidence that I just wasn't fishing around and trying to guess as to what, my questions were about. So I think that helped in the confidence level. And I say what I'm about to say to a lot of young journalists is when you say A, you have to do A. You can't say A and do B or C. And so when you're talking to somebody and you say to them that this information that you're giving me is on background, and this is how we're gonna use it in the magazine, you're a former coach or you're a former player. And I never used off the record, because off the record to me meant, and it means to me, and I think it's fair to say it means it to a lot of journalists, is you can't use that information. You're telling me this off the record, which means I can't use it in any way, shape, or form. So I would always try to talk to people about, well, we'd love to use this information, but we have to use it in a way that you feel comfortable. Because if we get sued, we're going to need your help in court. And, knock on wood, I've never set foot in a courtroom in my life, and I've never been deposed in my life. And that's because I learned very early on at the magazine that you have to, dot all your I's and cross all your T's in terms of that kind of stuff. And I just felt like, when you're doing these kinds of big investigations, it's almost like putting 1,000-piece puzzle together. You have to take each individual piece, make sure that piece is solid. And then when that piece interlocks into another piece, that's where you get, big sports gambling stories and big stories about steroids and Nebraska football or whatever, the Tulane point shaving, Phoenix Suns point shaving, huge stories that have, enormous implications for the magazine, libel laws and everything else. So I was just really careful, but I think it's a relationship business, Chris. If you talk to people and, they can understand that I'm passionate about what I do. And I still have friends that I've done tough stories on. Sonny Vaccaro is one of my very good friends, who's was the guy who really, brought the whole shoe business into college basketball. When we did a book called Raw Recruits back in 1990, Alex Wolf and I, it wasn't easy on Sonny in that book. We weren't easy on him, but because I was so fair and we were so fair and we were really conscious of trying to tell their side of the story, Sonny and I have remained very good friends to this day. And a lot of the people that I've had tough stories on, I'm still friends with them. It's because I'm not in it it's not about me, and I say this now, it's like when I talk to people, they say, well, why should I talk to you? I say, well, look, I already have a reputation. All I can do now is screw it up, and you're borrowing on my reputation. When I sit down with you and we would say these things at 60 Minutes, when you sit down with me, I'm giving you a certain credibility and cachet by the fact that I trust your story enough to sit with you and let you tell it. and I'm going to be fair about it. And so I think all of that quotient, that goes into being an investigative journalist, or just a journalist with a lot of curiosity.
I understand it's not easy to make the transition from print journalism to broadcast journalist, but you did exactly that when you made the leap to ABC News. Was that a case of right place, right time, or more than that? And how did you put yourself in the position to make that happen and then succeed in that new, as you mentioned before, pressure-filled role?
Well, that was a golden opportunity. It came up. I had kind of come to the end of my rope with the magazine on certain investigations that I had spent a great deal of time on and didn't find their way in. I was frustrated. It was a summer of 1989. People may remember that was the summer of the Pete Rose scandal. And ABC News, which was the #1 rated nightly news program at the time, was really getting its butt kicked by NBC News in the coverage of the Rose scandal. So Roone Arledge, the legendary Roone Arledge, who was the chairman of the news division and the sports division at the time, put the word out that they were looking to hire a reporter, sports reporter, that they could teach how to be a network television correspondent. I had just been at the Olympics in Seoul. My first television ever was on a Sunday night with Brian Gumbel on the opening night of the Olympics, where I kind of was on several times covering the swimming venue. And I was on television enough during the Olympics to put together a reel that got me an agent. My agent was one of the people that they called to say, we're looking for a young reporter, youngish reporter that we can train. I went through, there were 3 other people, Chris, to this day, I don't know who they were, that all did audition tapes. My audition tape was an umpire by the name of Dave Pallone, a major league umpire, who eventually came out and talked about the fact that he was gay. And that was the first time that a major league umpire had ever admitted that they were gay. Well, through friends of the family, I got to Pallone, and that was my audition tape. A major league umpire admitting that he was gay. Never saw the light of day. It was just shown inside ABC News. And getting Roone into one of those meetings where he could make a decision was really tough. He was notorious for never wanting to take a lot of meetings and things like that. They finally got him in this star chamber kind of meeting. They played all the tapes. And as the story goes, he looked at all and he said, I want that guy. And that guy was me. And I get emotional talking about this because it literally changed my life. I called my agent from a payphone at the Houston airport. Dee Dee and I, she was pregnant with our second daughter, Kelly. I called my agent and I said, he goes, they made a decision. And I said, what did they say? And they said, they want you. I mean, that was life-changing for me. And
awesome.
So I went, I go there and this is the heyday of ABC News. And, Dick Schaap is there, Ray Gandolf is there, Aaron Brown is there, it's Jennings, it's Koppel, it's a rock star group of network television correspondents. And I don't really know anything other than I can write and I can report and I can interview. So I can storytell. I do 4 stories. I do 8 stories my first year at ABC News, 8. And I can tell you, they paid me $80,000. So it doesn't take much to figure out that math, how much I was making per story. But they stuck with me. They trained me. I got a PhD in television during the 8 years that I was there. And in the end, I went from 8 to 18 to 32 to 54 to 80 stories a year for both Nightline and World News Tonight and GMA. And I'm to this day, I'm just so grateful that A, I got the opportunity, and B, I didn't waste it. That was the most important thing, is that when that door opened, I was ready. I was ready journalistically. I was ready, I think, emotionally. And that's really having the confidence, to kind of, take that next steps forward. I was ready to take that step forward then. I had paid my dues at SI. I had done the Olympics for NBC, and I was ready to kind of step in the big time. And to ABC News' credit, they nurtured me until I really kind of knew what I was doing. They kept me under the radar until it was time for me to kind of step out into the light.
Your 2012 book with Jeff Benedict, The System, The Glory and Scandal of Big Time College Football, exposes what you described as the, quote, complex and perhaps broken machine that churns behind the glamour of college football. What did that machine look like back then, and is it any different today?
Well, I think one of the great successes of the system is that it broke down the machine into all these component parts. So we interviewed and profiled athletic directors, head coaches, directors of football operations. We had chapters on hostesses and tutors and strength coaches and a big time recruit. We made it so you could, like I talked about that puzzle, all those puzzle pieces fit together to show you the system. And even the guy that owned the strip club where all the players would hang out, or what it was like to be a star recruit or a star quarterback at Texas and places like that. So you understood, and it was money that was fueling the whole machine. That was the fuel. And really, that hasn't changed. It's still a money game. The system is I think, more powerful. There's more pressure. There's more money. You see it, with coaches getting hired and fired all the time. But that's the only thing that's changed, really, Chris, is that the stakes are so much higher because the payoffs are so much bigger. And I think the system in 2012 and the system in 2020 is virtually the same. But what's interesting is that a lot of what Jeff Benedict and I got out of that book, and which really kind of was groundbreaking in many ways, it'd be much more difficult now to do what we did because the schools are much more conscious of letting people inside their programs because so much is at stake.
Armen, before the break, you talked about the payoff in college football and college sports. We've seen a lot over the last several years in terms of male versus female athletes and what's the right equity. Do you think college players, particularly playing in the big money sports of football and basketball, should be paid?
Well, Chris, I think in a lot of ways they are paid. I think you have to look at the overall picture. Certainly, they're on scholarship, and those scholarships in many cases can be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars over the 4 years. So they're also now getting what's called cost of attendance. So the difference between a scholarship and the actual cost of attendance at a certain school could be $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 per student per year. So that's additional income that's going into the hands of scholarship athletes. And then you look at things like Pell Grants, which are provided to minority students to help them with the cost of education. So when people say, athletes aren't paid, that's just not true. I mean, student athletes are being paid. So, but then you look at things like, and this is where the rubber meets the road, the whole name, image, and likeness debate that's going on in college sports right now, which dates back to the Ed O'Bannon days and the whole EA Sports and Sonny Vaccaro taking it to court, and the NCAA's vigorous defense, and now opening their minds to the obvious answer, which is it's going to happen. Whether it happens next year or in the next few years, athletes are going to be able to profit from their name, their image, and their likeness, which means essentially their brand. So if you're Trevor Lawrence at Clemson and you can go out and sign autographs based upon the value of your signature, you're going to be able to do that. And where that money goes into a trust fund or something is, I think, still to be decided, but everybody's looking at it sort of at the end of a college career. If you had Tua Tagovailoa at Alabama, you can only imagine that if he had gone to one of Nick Saban's car dealerships and signed autographs there. It's all still, I think, very much in the embryonic stage. And I do believe, and for the longest time I was against it, I do believe that athletes should be paid something because the money is so big right now. When you look at football contracts for coaches that are in the $8 to $9 million range, and a vast majority of the coaches in the Power 5 conferences, whether it's the SEC or the Big 10 or the Pac-10 or the Big 12 or the Big 10, they're making $3-4 million a year. You have assistant coaches making, probably hundreds of assistant coaches making over $1 million a year now, certainly dozens of them. So those that are responsible for the machine, the system, so to speak, should they be paid? I do believe that they should be. How that's going to happen, I think, is where the Pandora's box is, because you can only imagine. I mean, recruiting is a dirty business now as it is. It doesn't get a lot of publicity because it's so far underground, and it's an all cash business. So to be able for the NCAA's enforcement staff to be able to dig out and dig up the kind of dirt that would be needed to make a major infractions case against a Power 5 football team is going to be very difficult because it's so subterranean. So what do? Do you offer a kid who's a star fullback, or not a fullback, a star quarterback, an impact player, a wide receiver, a linebacker? Do you say to him, skip the money in the suitcase? We will let you sign autographs at my friend's car dealership 5 weekends a year, and we will pay you $50,000 every time you do that. So now it's $250,000. That's what's on the table. Well, what's going to keep another school from saying, well, you can do it 10 times a year and we'll pay you $75,000? I think that's where this thing is. There's no telling where it's going to go. And I think part and parcel of it is now with the social justice movement, and you're seeing like what you saw in the Pac-12 where the players said enough is enough. You know, they're starting to see the value, really see the value proposition for them. And I think you're going to see an entirely different paradigm in the next few years. How it's going to look, I think God only knows. But I don't think you're going backwards here.
You know, we've been talking about college football for the last couple of minutes. What do we do about equity for women athletes? Many of their programs don't make money, but those athletes work just as hard, you know, if not harder. How should they be treated financially?
Well, I think they absolutely should be treated equally. And you can go back to Title IX in 1971, the landmark legislation that said equal opportunity for women in sports. It was equal opportunity for women in college, but it was equal opportunity for women in sports. It was an absolute landmark piece of legislation. You know, that's now what, we're like 50 years. And, you know, you can still argue that women are not being treated fairly and equally on college campuses across the country. I think they should have equal access to scholarships. They certainly have equal access in the major programs now to scholarships and training and facilities and food and all those things. Is the travel the same? No, it's not. Are they on charter planes? Not to the degree that college football teams, and I almost said it, pro football teams, which they really sort of are. But the problem is it's the money factor. In terms of the football teams are the engine that drives the university. And the irony here is that of the Power 5 schools, there's probably only, you know, let's say of the top 100 football programs and basketball programs in the country, let's just say football, there's probably only 12 or so that actually turn a real profit. Most of them are being financed by either university funds or student fees, which have become really egregious in a lot of ways at certain schools, where those who maybe not even going to a game are forced to pay to support the football program. The argument is, why do they do that? Because football teams are the front porch of a university. They're the reason people that apply to a school. They're the reason people donate to a school. I mean, you don't have to look any further than what happened at the University of Alabama when Nick Saban showed up. I know for a fact, we live in Fairfield County, Connecticut. You could have put the number of people that wanted to go to the University of Alabama before Nick got there on a blanket, you know, in somebody's bedroom, maybe a half a dozen people. Now, when they send a person up here into Fairfield County, whether they go to Darien High School, New Canaan, Fairfield, Greenwich, you name it, there are 200 or 300 kids and their families in there that want to go to that school. 35% of before Nick were out-of-state students. 57% of the University of Alabama, it could be more now, that was the last number I saw, could be 60% are coming from out of state. It's been an enormous impact. That's why they pay coaches like Nick Saban what they pay him, and he's worth every penny of it. The problem is when you overpay, what gets cut? Well, we're seeing it now in the pandemic. I mean, the amount of so-called non-revenue sports, and they are non-revenue, that are paying the price for the fact that they can't put fans in the stands, that they can't sell merchandise the way they were before. They can't pay for the parking and everything else that goes into it. Donors aren't donating like they have in the past because they're not at the games in order to feel the power of the program. This is all going to shake out in the next year or two. And I think women's sports right now, I mean, when Stanford cuts their women's sports, that tells you basically all you need to know. Not all of them, but some of them. A school that has that kind of an endowment, that is part of a regional television network, that has a national reputation, starts cutting sports. I think there has to be a reevaluation of what's important holistically on these campuses. And I think that you can't walk away from equal opportunity and equality for women. And if you do, you're going to pay a price in terms of, I mean, Fresno State just cut their women's lacrosse team, because I have a very good friend, Julie Romanowski, Bill's wife, who is very close with that program. Her daughter played there. The guy that sued Brown University way back in the first Title IX lawsuit, I think his name is Arthur Brown, he just sued Fresno State over a Title IX violation with the women's lacrosse program. And if you think that's the first lawsuit that's going to happen in the next year or so, you got another thing coming.
The front porch of a college university, and that's a perfect analogy. And to your point about Alabama, you know, I can't count the number of Roll Tide or the big Scarlet A stickers I see in cars driving around. So I think you're absolutely correct in that point. It's incredible what Nick Saban has done. Yeah,
it is. And the thing is, it's been for the benefit of the university. I mean, all that money's not going into the football program. I mean, they're building buildings there because of Nick Saban. They're building new dormitories. I've been down to that school. It's one of the most beautiful campuses in the country. And, you know, Nick's statue is already in front of the stadium, but they should put it on 2 or 3 other places on that campus, because there's classrooms and there's labs being built because of what Nick has done. And Nick and his wife, Terry, have donated, I can't tell you how much money back to the school.
Let's switch over to the business side of journalism for a few minutes if we can.
Sure.
So what does Armen Keteyian, 11-time Emmy Award winner, tell a kid in journalism school these days? Are they in the right profession? Should they be looking at other options?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the business is changing so quickly, from day to day, sometimes hour to hour, it changes. What I would say to a young person coming up, it's very different than when I was coming up. I was a, Woodward Bernstein, Watergate baby. There were opportunities for me to go into, as we've talked about, sort of the minor leagues of journalism, to cut my teeth at a suburban daily, and to freelance at the San Diego Union and the San Diego Magazine. Those opportunities are, they're dwindling. They're being eliminated right and left. So you have to look at it a different way. You have to say to yourself, okay, do I love telling stories? Do I love the process of writing and reporting and interviewing and editing? Because if you're in TV, if you want to be in television, you have to do all of those things now. Whereas when I started in television, all I had to do was be the correspondent. I had a camera person, I had editors. Now, when you're coming up through the ranks at a local television, if you can't do all those things, you're not going to get hired. So I would say to people, there's still opportunity out there. The business is changing. It's going digital. You have to figure out whether you want to start a podcast, or whether you want to do documentary films, or you want to cover politics. You're young, follow your dreams, follow your passion. I always I say this to my daughters and I've said it to other people. I never chased the money. I never did. I followed my passion. As my wife will tell you, I'm not the guy that you want to call to fix the dishwasher, right? Or if a light bulb goes out, that's about the extent of my ability to fix something around the house.
You and me both.
Yeah. But that's why we have Frank. No,
Exactly. He's got a guy.
He's our guy. But if you want somebody to tell a story, then I'm a guy you want to talk to, because that's what I love to do. And I know the component parts of that. And I've gotten good at it over the years. And so I would say to a young person is follow your dreams, follow your passion. And if it doesn't work out in journalism, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? You've learned how to write, you've learned how to report, you've learned how to tell a story. So whether you're writing an argumentative letter to the phone company because of service, or you're telling a story of, somebody's birthday party, all of those things that you learn as a journalist are absolutely transferable into other lines of work. And I think that's where, that's what you have to look at it, because I think now if you're looking to make a fortune as a journalist or make a living as a journalist, you really have to know that it's going to be a hard road ahead, because the opportunities just aren't there as they were when I came through.
As we come down the home stretch of this show here, let's bounce back to sports. Does the pandemic change anything long-term in pro or college sports, whether it's on the sidelines, in the stands, the locker room, the corporate suites?
Well, I think it's changed. It's been an absolute game changer. It's changed almost everything in terms of coverage. I know from being in, having covered the NFL from the sidelines for years and years, I know what the sideline reporters are doing now, and they're basically disassociated from the field of play, where I could move from one sideline to another sideline and feel the flow of a game. And I could just walk around in a commercial timeout or do whatever I needed to do. I could hear things and see things that I could report on. Sideline reporters now are basically on a little moat in the stands where they have to have the coaches and the players come to them. That makes that particular job so hard to do. And when you have announcers now announcing games remotely, I just read today that the Brooklyn Nets announced that their announcers will do both home games and away games from Barclays Arena. So that means they won't travel with the team, which means you really don't interact with the players. And I think that's another thing. And it works both ways. That is a double-edged sword. Schools have realized that media opportunities can be limited to a Zoom call with a coach or a Zoom call with a player. That eliminates the opportunity to interact with that coach, or maybe wait out all the other reporters in the room because you want to ask the coach one particular question for a story that you're working on or something that you're interested in. The same thing with a player. Obviously, fans in the stands. It'll be interesting to see when the vaccine is widely available, how many people decide they want to put themselves in that kind of an environment. Because we still haven't determined whether it's going to be a bracelet or what do? They put a star on your forehead or whatever it is that you've taken the vaccine. And as you and I both know, and this is not something that hasn't been discussed, there's a large segment of society that will not take the vaccine, whether it's for religious reasons or whether it's they don't believe in the vaccine as far as they have issues with autism, or whether just politically they don't believe that there was a virus to start with. That is all to be determined. And so I think the pandemic in some ways has opened the eyes of teams, as it is in our own professions, that you don't have to do things the same way. But I think it's going to further limit the interaction between broadcast teams and reporters. And I don't think that's going to be to the betterment. I think it's going to be the detriment of the information flow.
So we talked earlier about your #1 New York Times bestseller book that you co-wrote with Jeff Benedict, Tiger Woods. There's a lot of questions I can ask here, a lot I want to ask. I know we're short on time, but just a couple maybe quick ones here is,
Sure.
did you and Jeff come up with the idea? How did you Did you approach Tiger directly? What was it like working with Tiger? And I guess at the end what was his reaction once the book was finally published?
Well, I'll back up to the beginning. So we had done the system. that was really started in, way back around 2012 when I think we started the book. There had been 10. So when you make a proposal for a book, it's a fairly, at times it can be a pretty big document. Our proposal for the system was 60 pages long. Our proposal for Tiger was 4 pages long. And the reason we decided to do the book was our agent called us up and he said, have you guys ever thought about doing a book on Tiger Woods? And we're like, Tiger Woods? I mean, there's got to be 100 books on Tiger Woods. What are you talking about? And so he goes, well, do a little research and come back and let me know. And so we started to look around and there were a lot of books, not 100, but at least a dozen. But as it turned out, Chris, they were all done on certain periods of Tiger's life. It was right after he turned pro. It was during his great run in the early 2000s. It was certainly, there was 1 or 2 written after, he hit the fire hydrant in 2009 and his life, fell off a cliff. His dad had written books. Tiger had written a book, but no one had ever done this 360-degree view of Tiger's life, going back to Earl's life, digging into the mother-father dynamic that was so important in Tiger's upbringing and the influence on Tiger. And so when we decided to do that, we told the publishers that we needed 3 years, which is the longest I've ever worked on a book. And between Jeff and I now, we've done, I think, 25 nonfiction books between the two of us. We had reputations that were built around New York Times bestselling books. And we said we needed the 3 years because we needed that amount of time to do all the reading that we felt was necessary to sort of start out in the hunt to understand who is Tiger Woods. And to answer your question about Tiger, yes, we did reach out to Tiger's people. We were I'd say about 8 or 10, 9 months into the reporting of the book, because we really didn't know what we didn't know. And so we wrote a letter to Glenn Greenspan, who was his top PR person, and Mark Steinberg, who was his agent. And we said that we would like to explore the opportunity of interviewing Tiger for our book. And, what we got in return was not unexpected, actually fairly predictable, given their responses to people in the past. But I wrote these words down today because I think they're important. Their response was condescending, demeaning, unprofessional, and antagonistic.
As expected.
Yeah. And it was unprofessional in the sense that you're dealing with two guys that have fairly significant reputations as journalists. We came in the front door. We asked you for the opportunity to at least consider an interview with Tiger. And what we got in response was you need to tell us everybody that you've talked to, both on the record and off the record, everything they've told you. And we need a list of questions prior to even considering whether Tiger would talk to you. Now, I worked as a contributing correspondent to 60 Minutes for almost 10 years. We interviewed heads of state, whether it was President Obama, President Bush, Vladimir Putin, you name them. There was never that kind of request from anybody that they had to see the questions in advance. So what we decided to do, we agreed to disagree with Tiger's people. Now, what did Tiger think of the book? Honestly, to this day, Chris, I don't know, because nobody in the golf world that I'm aware of, being the golf world, has ever asked Tiger about what he feels like and how he reacted to the book. I don't believe he read it, but it would be interesting to know whether he's aware of it. I mean, it would be almost impossible not to be aware of it, considering it made the New York Times bestseller list. But, we'll see. The HBO documentary is coming up. You mentioned it'll be in January. I'm not sure yet what the dates are. It's mesmerizing. I've seen it. It's a remarkable 3.5-hour film broken up into 2 parts. And It'll be interesting to see what Tiger has to say about this, whether anybody asks him about it, because when it premieres on HBO, it's going to be a little harder to ignore than whether it, premieres on the New York Times bestseller list.
Armen, you've had an extraordinary career and accomplishments, impact, durability, and longevity. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for being with us today.
You bet, Chris. Thank you so much.
And thank you for tuning in to Next Steps Forward. I'm Chris Meek. Be sure to tell your friends and family that we'll be back next Tuesday, same time, same place, with another leader from the world of business, politics, sports, or entertainment. Until then, stay safe and keep taking your next steps forward.